Boeing has been a behemoth business building better planes that break barriers and best other businesses' ability to beat them since the birth of the Boeing 707 to the burgeoning Boeing 787.
Stop it. Get some help.
Over the years, we've seen Boeing drag some of these aircraft families along for over 60 years, sometimes with mixed results. While other aircraft families have come and gone, why is it that some of them had relatively short production runs while others have endured the test of time? Today we're looking at every discontinued Boeing commercial jetliner, from the 707 all the way to the most recently canceled 747. We'll then add each aircraft to the ultimate aircraft ranking system that I developed. Examining the landscape of the aviation industry, and as military contracts were drying up post-World War II, Boeing looked to capitalize on a developing new trend, leisure travel. They looked on as competitors were having success, such as the 106 Comet, which was the first jetliner to market. It entered service in 1952. Boeing knew that jetliners were the future of commercial air travel. They just had to crack the code on how to best utilize the technology and market it. What came next was the Boeing 707, the most successful early jetliner by a fair margin. It made strides in safety, technology, and in cost. Its first flight was in 1957. Now, Boeing was no stranger to mass production at the time. Given their experience in World War II, it was no doubt that they had a leg up on many competitors by being able to sell the 707 to a wide customer base. Eventually, they built 1,019 707s, not including military variants such as the E3, the E6, or the E8 Joint Stars, all of which are still flying today. Before we get into scoring the 707, I will explain a little bit of the philosophy behind the ultimate aircraft ranking system. It's a system I painstakingly developed in order to standardize the key metric categories of aircraft in a way that lets us compare aircraft of any type of any era. It is meant to score these aircraft in the most objective way possible. This is done by scoring an aircraft based on 5 weighted categories. Those categories are cost, speed, versatility, innovation, and effectiveness. Each category has metrics assigned to them that lets us compare aircraft with similar roles from its era. After comparing these metrics, the aircraft is then given a score from 1 to 10, 10 being the highest based off of these metrics. If you want to know more about the details, feel free to check out the video I made explaining the full methodology behind the system. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and look at the cost of the 707. Inflation adjusted, the 707 is about $50.4 million, which is less than its competitor, the DC-8, but it has the 707 beat on a per passenger basis at $267,000 per passenger, much more than the Comet, but still one of the most affordable aircraft on a per passenger basis. This gives the 707 a score of 8 for cost. The next category we have is speed. So the only thing that really matters for airlines is money. And in this case, that means cruise speed, because most airlines are really not going to exceed this speed regularly, as it would lead to a decrease in fuel efficiency. So the 707 cruise speed was about Mach 0.636, which is faster than in contemporary prop planes, but not faster than its competitor, the DC-8. That gives it a 6 for speed. As I mentioned earlier, the 707 proved to be a very versatile platform, especially since it still has operating variants such as the E3 Sentry, the E6 Mercury, and the E8 Joint Stars. It had a production run of over 20 years, proving its usefulness as the best option for airlines at the time. It sported a range of over 5,800 miles, much longer than its predecessors, but less than its main competitor, the DC-8. All of this collectively earns the 707 a 7 for versatility. Although the 707 was launched 8 years after the first jetliner, it's still remembered as a pioneer in the jet age. It also greatly improved on the incumbents' designs and proved to be one of the most successful of its age. It led to a big shift in the way that air travel was done at the time, spurring innovations in airlines such as driving huge increases in demand for leisure travel. Not only that, but its fuselage and design elements would be the basis for the 727 and 737, each of which would go on to be the most successful aircraft in their respective ages. The 707 earns a 7 for innovation as well. Since the most important part of a commercial aircraft is taking people from point A To be as safely as possible, I consider safety to be one of the most important factors in effectiveness. To truly determine how safe an aircraft was, I researched and compiled all of the incidences of hull losses and fatalities of every commercial flight since the advent of commercial flight for each aircraft. In my previous video, I explained exactly how the hull loss and fatality factor work, so if you want a little more of the details of how this work, feel free to check out that video. But suffice to say that a score of 1 is about average, so you really want a score as close to 0 as possible. A score of 0 would mean that you have had no aircraft losses and no fatalities for each of those scores. In this case, the hull loss factor for the 707 is 5.11, or in other words, based off of the number of aircraft produced, it crashed 5.11 times more than it should have, which means it definitely is not the safest plane ever to be produced. For a fatality factor, the 707 gets a 3.57. Not good, abysmal by today's standards, but almost twice as safe as any of its predecessors. With all of that said, and the fact that the 707 was a veritable pioneer, arguably launching the industry into the jet age, selling more than any other commercial aircraft before it, and it still lives on in military variants, it very easily scores an 8 for effectiveness. Overall, the Boeing 707 score is 7.2. Riding on the success of the 707, Boeing looked to capitalize on a growing trend of shorter haul flights. To do so, they wanted to introduce an aircraft that had more capabilities in a shorter range, which meant a smaller floor plan aircraft being built, and the result of this demand was the Boeing 727, which first flight took place in 1963. Its inflation-adjusted cost is $65.7 million, or $347,000 per passenger, which is toward the lower end of this cost basis, and it's well below the approximate inflation-adjusted average price per passenger for most aircraft, which is around $485,000. That gives it a cost score of 6. As for speed, it has a below average cruise speed of about Mach 0.74, which is definitely not the slowest commercial aircraft, but it was on par for that era. That gives it a score of 4 for speed. Its range was about 2,590 miles, a fairly limited range, especially compared to its predecessor, the 707. It had a max passenger count of 189 passengers, and it didn't have nearly as many variants as the 707, just a few handful of freighter variants and a few military variants, the C-22. Its limited range and relative lack of variance compared to the predecessor of the 707 give the 727 a score of 4 for versatility. As for innovation, the 727 was the first commercial aircraft to have an APU, or an auxiliary power unit, to provide power while the aircraft is on the ground. It also had a built-in air stair in order for you to exit the aircraft without the need for external staircases. This was meant to accommodate smaller airports. It was also the first jetliner to have hydraulic-powered flight controls. It was also a pioneer in the area of testing. The 727 incorporated fatigue testing before it was standard operating procedures and FAA regulations. Again, with the airline's requirements, the 727 had a short takeoff roll distance due to the high lift wings and tail-mounted engines, as airlines wanted to be able to reach smaller airports. Overall, it gets a pretty impressive 8 for innovation. As for safety, its hull loss factor was 1.83, which is a significant improvement from the 707's 5.11. As for fatality factor, it comes in at 2.62, which is pretty dang terrible for today's standards, but a noticeable improvement from its predecessor, the 707, which stood at 3.57. It had a 21-year production run, and it still has 44 in service today, which is pretty impressive as well. There were 1,832 727s produced, making it the 5th most produced commercial aircraft line in history, and the most produced commercial aircraft at its time. Overall, that makes up about 3.5% of all commercial aircraft ever produced, scoring it an 8 for effectiveness. That earns the 727 an overall score of 6.30. And right about now is where we would normally discuss the production and development of the 747, but we've already dedicated an entire video talking about the 747. So for the 747, we'll just jump straight into the ranking. Its inflation-adjusted cost per unit is $418 million, the second most expensive commercial aircraft of all time. Its per passenger cost is $690,000, also the 4th most expensive commercial aircraft on a per seat basis, It gets an easy 3 for cost. The 747 was actually the fastest commercial jet ever produced, with the exception of the Concorde, so it gets a 9 for speed. Unlike its modern competitor, the A380, the 747 was actually designed with cargo variants in mind. So much so that the cockpit was put on the second floor to allow for a door to be put into the nose of the aircraft on cargo variants. The 747 also had many variants produced in its era, such as the iconic Air Force One, the E4, and even the shuttle transport. It had an impressive range of 9,200 miles, the 5th most of any commercial aircraft, and had a max passenger count of a single class configuration of 605 passengers. Of course, the big drawback for the 747 is that it stopped selling so much due to its enormous capacity and the difficulty for airlines to make this aircraft profitable due to the fact that they had to sell an enormous amount of seats on this aircraft to make any route possible. It gets a 7 for versatility. As for innovation, the fuel efficiency of the 747 was around 89 miles per gallon per passenger for medium haul routes and 83 miles per gallon per seat on long haul routes, which is pretty average nowadays. You'd expect them to do more given the enormous amount of seats that it could have, but its massive size just makes it too inefficient. I won't go into all the innovative design here, but it was a very monumental plane for its era. Obviously, it was the first jumbo jet ever to market, and it completely revolutionized the industry. I already talked more about it in my videos, so if you're interested to learn more about the innovation of the 747, feel free to watch. So it gets an 8 for innovation. As for effectiveness, the 747 had a pretty significant production duration of 53 years. There are 481 747s still in operation. The total units produced of the 747 is 1,573, which is impressive, but when you consider how long the production run of the 747 was, it honestly should have been more, but it vastly outperformed its most comparable rival, the A380, which only produced a mere 251. The 747 makes up about 3% of every commercial aircraft ever manufactured, and it has a hull loss factor of 1.09, which is very good considering it was born and rose to prominence in the most dangerous era of commercial aircraft travel. But it does have a higher fatality factor at 2.26, likely to the immense number of fatalities that would occur in any instance of a total loss of the aircraft. Certainly, it was not the safest aircraft, but not terrible considered its longevity and when the aircraft was produced. Overall, it gets a 6 for effectiveness, which earns the 747 an overall score of 7.05. In the early 70s, Boeing was looking to replace the 727 with a more efficient jet. The 757 was that answer. Developed alongside the 767, many designs and philosophies were borrowed from the 67. Much of the design and philosophies from the design of the 767 were incorporated onto the 757. In fact, its pilots who completed a short course could fly both aircraft, the 757 and 67, due to the fact that they were so similar. The 757 first flew in 1982 and had a fairly successful run of 22 years, producing 1,050 aircraft, making it the 17th most successful commercial aircraft ever. However, its pretty successful production run was cut abruptly short. After 9/11, commercial air travel took a huge hit. Airlines saw huge drops in demand at the time and weren't looking to acquire aircraft such as the 757. The inflation-adjusted cost of the 757 is around $135.5 million. That gives it a per passenger cost of $459,000, which is about average as you can be, giving it a score of 5 for cost. It has a pretty average cruise speed of about Mach 0.8. That earns it a score of 5 as well. The 757 ended up having a good number of variants such as the C-32, which is commonly used as Air Force 2 or to transport many members of the president's cabinet or Congress members on official government business. It also has been pretty successful as a freighter aircraft, with many freighter aircraft still in operation today. Its range is about 4,500 miles and the max passenger count of a single configuration of 295. Overall, it was fairly successful with a good number of variants for a 20-year production run. It scores a 6 for versatility. As far as innovation innovation goes, the 757 was designed with the anticipation that it would be a more fuel-efficient aircraft than the 727, and it absolutely achieved that goal. The 757 ended up being 45% more fuel efficient than the Boeing 727. Its fuel efficiency for regional routes is about 88.4 miles per gallon per seat, which is a huge increase in efficiency for commercial aircraft when it first flew, only really rivaled by the 737-800 with 85 miles per gallon per seat, which launched just the year prior. It wasn't until 2013 when a competitor would first put up a more efficient regional aircraft with the A220. For short-haul flights, the 757 comes in at about 98 miles per gallon per seat. This efficiency made it the market leader until it was ultimately usurped by the A220 again, and for medium-haul routes it has an efficiency of 78 miles per gallon per seat, where it doesn't seem to have stood out quite as much. Other than its great efficiency, it seems Boeing really didn't try to reinvent the wheel with this one. Most of the efficiency gains were due to the great thrust-to-weight ratio provided by these giant engines on this little pencil aircraft, and some work was done on weight reduction and aerodynamics. But much of the design leaned on previous Boeing designs, such as the 767 and the 727. Overall, it earns a score of 6 for innovation. For effectiveness, it had a production run of 22 years, and it has about 683 aircraft in service, and total units produced were about 1,050. The percentage of commercial aircraft that this makes up is about 2%. Its whole loss factor is 0.31 and a fatality factor of 0.51, which is absolutely a good safety record for the era. It earns a 6 for effectiveness. That earns the 757 an overall score of 5.85. So how did all these retired aircraft line up against each other? First, the 757 in last place at 5.85. The 727 comes in next at 6.3. Next up, we have the iconic Queen of the Skies, the 747, at a score of 7.05, which leads us to our top contender, the Boeing 707, with a score of 7.20. But what about the planes Boeing's making today? How do they stack up against their old retired aircraft? And are they better than the 737? In my next video, we're going to be discussing each of Boeing's current production run aircraft, so make sure you're subscribed and hit the notification bell if you want to be notified for when that video comes out. Thank you so much for watching the video up to this point, and Godspeed.